In this tutorial, we'll talk about using Spotlight Redact in Avid Media Composer. And Spotlight Redact is an effect that's part of the dTective suite of tools from Ocean Systems, and it allows you to highlight and or obscure up to 4 areas of video with a single effect. So let's talk about how it works. So in this clip, I have myself interviewing this truck driver. So there's 2 areas we can either highlight or obscure. So let's create a new sequence. We'll just click in here, drag and drop down to our timeline to create a new sequence. Hit home on the keyboard to take us back to the beginning of the clip. And then we're going to apply Spotlight by going to Tools, choose Effect Palette, go to the dTective category, click on Spotlight Redact, and drag and drop down to the clip on your timeline. And then to open the effect controls, you can either click here on Effect Mode, and that opens the effect editor, or go to Tools and choose Effect Editor. Okay. Now with the effect editor open, you'll notice a little circle appears here. That's your first spotlight. You can click on it and drag it to reposition it. You can resize it. There are little handles on the corner. There's also handles on the top and bottom to let you change the height, and handles on the side to change the width. So once we get that dialed in, we can talk about the effect controls over here. The first control you have is for the background. That's going to be everything that's outside of the spotlight. So we have transparent. So that would assume there's another layer of video. I don't have that now, so it's just black. Blur, mosaic, scatter, and emboss. So we'll use the blur option, and we'll talk about the effect controls here. You have magnitude, that's the amount of blur. Anywhere from 0 to 500. And then there's brightness, contrast, gamma, saturation, and mix. Mix is essentially the opacity of this overall blur effect, or really any effect you've applied. So if I change this to 0 by dragging to the left, none of this blur effect has been applied. And then go back to 100, and it's fully opaque, and anything in between. Okay. Now, if some of these effects are a bit too much, you can actually zero them out. If you highlight any effect, any slider, you see it turns gray. Push 0 on the keyboard. That zeroes out those effect settings. So we'll do that for all of these except for magnitude. We'll keep magnitude where it was. Okay, so now let's talk about the first spotlight. Your first spotlight is enabled. The copy style from option lets you copy styles from other spotlights, so that's useful after you've changed the effects here, and you can copy them to a new spotlight. So we'll talk about that in a bit. Position, X and Y. So X will be left and right. Those are coordinates, and then Y up and down. That's the same as dragging here. You see if I drag, these change. Okay. Width and height, that's the same as dragging here. So if I drag width over, let me see what happens. Same with height. And you can skew it. Let's move this down a bit. And then you can rotate. And then roundness, that basically changes the overall roundness of the effect. So if I go to the left, it's more square. And then more to the right is more round. And I can actually turn these, this green box can be turned off. So go down to the very bottom of the effect editor, and you see where it says show boxes. That will turn off those borders, those little controls. And I can more easily show you what roundness looks like. Just like that. Let's turn those back on for a second. And we'll talk about the border. So border right now is an outline. It can be none, no border. It can be a feather, and feather just softens the edges of this effect. So if I crank this over to the right really far, let's move this over a bit so you can see. And in fact, I'm going to turn these borders, these boxes off again so you can really see. And see how it's softened it. So that's a feather. Let's turn this back on now. Go back to outline and change this to a more normal sized outline. And we can talk about the color of the border. So right now it's white. If you want to change the color, there's a few ways to do it. You can double click this swatch right here. That opens up your color picker. You can just choose whatever color you want. Choose a red. You can also use the eyedropper tool, and the way this works is you hold down your left mouse button, keep it held down, drag it over, pick the color you want from within your composer window, then double click to apply it. I'll do that again. Left click, hold the mouse button down, drag, pick the color you want, double click to apply. Okay. And you can also use these sliders here. So if you wanted full red, just drag red to the right, and then take green and blue all the way to the left, and you got full red. And opacity, that's opacity of the outline. So how opaque is this outline? Anything from 0 back to 100 and everything in between. Okay. And let's go down and talk about the effects from inside this spotlight. I'm going to turn off the effects on the background real quick. And we'll talk about how the effects work inside the spotlight. So right now there's no effect applied. You can do transparent, blur. These are the same exact options you had for the background, but now they're being applied to the inside of the spotlight. Mosaic, scatter, and emboss. So let's talk about, we'll use blur and talk about these controls. Same controls as the background. You have magnitude, so how blurry is it? And then brightness, contrast, gamma, saturation, and mix. Mix is basically just opacity. That's the opacity of the effects you've applied inside the spotlight. Okay. And the same thing here, you can highlight any of these sliders. They turn gray, push 0 on your keyboard, and these adjustments will be zeroed out. Just like that. All right. Let's move down to add another spotlight. The way you do that is just turn it on. You hit enable. That applies a second spotlight. And now here's where the copy style from option comes into play, because now I can copy the style from spotlight 1, and I have an exact copy of the first one, which I can then move over and I can do whatever I need to do. Okay, so that's how the spotlight effects work. And there's another option here you'll see that says animation. And this involves keyframing, which we're going to talk about next. So I'm not going to talk about this just yet, but when we talk about keyframing, I'll talk about how to use the animation feature. So let's talk about how to use keyframes with Spotlight Redact. Okay, keyframing in Spotlight Redact, let's talk about how that works. We're going to keyframe this airplane taking off. We'll have a spotlight effect follow it as it takes off. So let's go ahead and create a new sequence by dragging and dropping to our timeline. Hit home on the keyboard to go back to the beginning. Go to Tools. Select Effect Palette, go to the dTective category, here's Spotlight Redact, drag and drop onto our clip on our timeline. And then Tools, Effect Editor will open up the Effect Editor. And we can talk about how keyframes work. So we're going to want to have this spotlight follow this airplane as it takes off. So we'll start by dragging it down, getting it centered on the plane, just like that. And then whenever you drag the spotlight effect, as you scroll down your timeline, if you drag the spotlight effect and have it follow an object like this, those keyframes are added automatically in the effect editor. So you can see here, Spotlight 1 under Shape, let's resize this a bit. Avid automatically added keyframes for position, so X and Y. So it's saying here Shape has a keyframe added under position, and here are the two keyframes. If I also resize this spotlight, you'll see it adds keyframes for width and height. So those keyframes are automatically added. Anything you do in the composer window, any adjustments you make, those keyframes are automatically added. But those are the only keyframes that Avid will automatically create for you. Everything else you do will need to be manually keyframed. So how do you do that? Well, let's take a look. Go back a bit. And say at this point I want to have a skew effect happen, and I want to keyframe it. If I go to skew, which is here, and you'll see as I make the adjustment, that keyframe's not being added at all. Nothing is added here, no keyframe at all. So how would you add a keyframe? There's a few ways to do it. The easiest way to do it, to add a keyframe to this parameter, is to right click on the parameter itself, this skew track right here, and choose add keyframe. And that will add a keyframe to that particular parameter, just like that. And if I go down a bit and right click again and choose add keyframe and make an adjustment to skew, you'll see that that happens correctly. And there's a few other ways to do this. So let's talk about that. So whenever I click in here and choose these tracks, rotate, roundness, you'll see that these sliders become highlighted. So if I click on the rotate track, that slider is highlighted. You can see it turn gray. And skew, the same thing. So if I go down here, this is the add keyframe button. Click on that, and there's a number of options here. You have add to active parameter. That's the parameter that's currently active. Active group, open groups, and enabled groups. So we'll talk about these individually. So if I say add to active parameter, it's going to add a keyframe to just the skew parameter, just like that. So skew is the one highlighted. So it says, okay, well, you had skew highlighted. I added a keyframe there for you. But if let me undo that. And if I choose add to active group is the group we're currently working in, which is position. So it's going to add a keyframe to every single parameter in the position category, the position group. So add to active group adds a keyframe to all of the position parameters. So I'll undo that. There's also add to open groups, and open groups is any group that's currently open. So right now we have Spotlight 1 open, and none of the other spotlights are open. So it's going to add a keyframe to every single parameter inside of Spotlight 1 when I choose add to open groups, which it did, but it didn't add a keyframe to anything else. As you can see, there's no keyframes added to Spotlight 2, 3, or 4. So let's undo that. The third one is add to enabled groups, and in Spotlight, by default, everything is enabled. So when I choose this, it's going to add a keyframe to all groups, which you can see it did. So all parameters of all groups, meaning all spotlights, now have a keyframe added to everything. Let's undo that. And the last one is add to all parameters. That's everything. That's pretty much what we just did, but if you want to make sure that everything has a keyframe, you can do that. So I'll undo that. Now, if you were to say, well, I like that I get a keyframe added for, I do an adjustment like this, I get keyframes automatically added for position, but I wish that I would also get keyframes added to everything else in this Spotlight 1. When I do that, you can choose to have that done. The way you do that is choose Auto Key Parameters. So click on Auto Key Parameters, and then when I make an adjustment inside the Composer window, like a width adjustment, you'll see that not only did I get keyframes added to width, but also height, skew, everything else got a keyframe added, even the ones that are not open. If I open these up, there's keyframes added to everything. So if you're wanting to add keyframes to everything as you work, that's the way you would do it. And how would you delete keyframes? There's a few ways to do that. The way you do that, if you click in here in your Composer window, these are the keyframes. Click on them here, and then you can push delete on the keyboard, and that will delete them there. You can see it's gone. Let me undo that. Let's choose this one. Now this one, when I added it, it added keyframes all the way down. So I could choose to delete all of them there, but maybe I only want to delete one of these parameters, because if I delete them now, they're all gone. Let me undo that, because maybe I say, well, I only want to delete the skew keyframe. So the way you would do that is to only click on the skew keyframe itself. So click on that, and now I can just delete the one keyframe under skew. So hit delete, and that's gone. If you want to delete all the keyframes in your effect, hit Control A from within the Composer window, and they're all selected. Then push delete on the keyboard, and they're all gone. Let's undo that. If you want to move keyframes, you can do that. Just click the keyframe you want to move, hold Alt on the keyboard. You'll see your cursor becomes a little hand, and that lets you move the keyframe as necessary. So I want to move this one, etc. Okay. If you want to go from keyframe to keyframe, so say I'm here and I want to go quickly to this one, this button right here is go to previous event. That's the next, or the previous keyframe, and that bounces you right to it. This is go to next event. That's the next keyframe, and that takes you right to it. So if you had a number of keyframes all bunched in together here, like if I added a bunch of keyframes, And it became kind of difficult to click on them individually. You're like, man, I can't really get in there and get those. You can use this to get to them quickly. And if you want to zoom into these keyframes, there's a slider right here that lets you do that. So that's another way to get to the keyframes a little easier. Okay, and I had mentioned earlier we'd talk about how the animation feature works. So let's go ahead and talk about that. First, let me finish this spotlight effect out real quick. So let's have the spotlight go up there and follow the plane. And I'm going to also change the border color so you can really see it when we're doing this animation feature. So let's change the border to red and change the size. So how does the animation feature work? Let's get into that. So if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll find the animation features here. This is a global setting, so it's an animation for all 4 of your spotlights if you have 4 enabled. You have fade on, fade off, and wipe outline, and then a duration. So let's talk about just adding a fade on, fade off first. And the way you do this is first go to the beginning of your timeline. So down here, click home on your keyboard. And right now, nothing's happening. There's no animation happening. Even though you turn it on, nothing's happening. All right. So, and I'll mute this timeline. What needs to happen is you need to add keyframes at the beginning and the end of your timeline. So wherever you want this spotlight to turn on, add a keyframe, and wherever you want it to disappear, add another keyframe. So we'll start at the beginning, go up to where it says enable, right click on the enable track at the very beginning and choose add keyframe, or I'll undo that. You can also go to add keyframe and choose add to active parameter. Either way, and then click end on your keyboard to go to the very end, or wherever you want the spotlight to disappear, either way, and then add another keyframe at that position in the enable track, just like that. And then we'll watch what happens. So let's go to the beginning, push home on the keyboard, and you'll see this animate on. And that faded on. That was pretty quick. So if you want to change the duration of that fade on, that's this duration right here. So change it. Be pretty slow. You can see it faded on slowly, and it'll fade off slowly as well. Watch that again. All right. And the same goes for the wipe outline effect. So push play. The keyframes are already there. You're just changing the type of animation. It's slow. So if you wanted to speed that up, just change the duration. There you go. So that's how the animation feature works. And then if you wanted to save this effect, the way you would do that, go to the top, find this little plugin icon, click on that, and drag it into your bin, just like that. Now it's in your bin. You can highlight it and then give it a new name. Call it plane. Okay, and if you want to delete the effect off your timeline, close the effect editor and push remove effect right here. And the effect is gone. So that's how Spotlight Redact works in Avid Media Composer.